The Stanton house stood at the edge of a crooked road that disappeared into the pine woods like a vein into something deeper. It was a farmhouse by form only, white paint flaking off its ribs, porch stoop sagging like a tired mouth. But to the townspeople of Varnum's Hollow it had become something else entirely. A sanctuary, they said, a haven. Mr. and Mrs. Stanton were the kind of people the church praised in sermons. Steady hands, quiet voices, eyes that listened. When the tuberculosis wave passed through the valley and left children behind, it was the Stanton house that opened its doors. Nobody questioned their willingness. The world was fraying and someone had to sow, and so the children came, alone, in pairs, once even 3 in a single month, and the house seemed to absorb them. Neighbors remembered the arrival wagons, small faces wrapped in scarves, tiny fists clutching what little they had left. But time passed strangely at the Stanton home. There were never schoolyard games. No footprints in the frost-heavy yard. No laughter behind the windows. The house had a way of remaining full yet never loud. That was the first detail that should have caught someone's breath. Inside, the home smelled of nutmeg and boiled linen. Visitors rarely made it past the kitchen. That space was warm, always warm, as if the fire never truly died. Pies cooling, soups stirred. Mrs. Stanton's smile was the kind that told you she was tired but grateful, the kind that discouraged deeper questions. The children were always asleep, she would say, or still adjusting. Their routines delicate. The boys don't like noise, the girls don't like strangers. Visitors were offered tea but rarely glimpsed a child. And when pressed, Mr. Stanton would mention letters, always letters, from relatives who eventually took the children back. He kept a ledger, he said, where everything was properly documented. No one asked to see it. It didn't feel necessary. The Stantons were doing God's work. It felt wrong to ask for receipts. But the town's memory was longer than its patience. People began to count in quiet. Mrs. Linwood remembered the boy with the bent glasses. The postman recalled the girl with the cough. One child, maybe, could be forgotten, but not 7, not 10. And when the school teacher asked the town clerk about enrolling the Stanton children in the new district census, something cold floated up from the records. No one had ever listed the Stanton address under any student. Not once. The house that had taken in orphans for 8 years had never enrolled a single child. Not in school, not in church programs, not even in the winter coat drives. It was as if every child who entered became a kind of echo, a name said once, then never again. But still the Stantons smiled. By the fall of 1905, the house had expanded. An upstairs addition had been built, hastily, some thought, with 8 new beds ordered from a traveling carpenter who left town after just 2 days. He'd told someone at the general store that he was paid in cash, told to work at night, and never to ask why there were no pillows. The beds, he said, were nailed directly to the floorboards, as if the children were not supposed to move them, as if they were not supposed to leave, but the man didn't stick around long enough to worry. People came and went in those days, and the Stantons paid on time. The first person to speak out loud was Widow Ferris, who lived 2 miles east and sometimes brought bread to the home on Sundays. She was met with closed curtains and silence. Once she thought she heard someone whispering from the attic vent, but when she stepped closer, the sound stopped. Later, she told the pastor she'd seen a small handprint inside the fog of the window pane. No taller than her thigh. She didn't go back, but she didn't go to the police either. In towns like Varnum's Hollow, suspicions were held like breath, tight and private, waiting for someone braver to exhale first. The sheriff came only once, years later. He was looking for a boy who'd wandered off from a neighboring county. Someone told him the Stantons had taken in strays before. He knocked on the door, asked a few questions. Mrs. Stanton gave him tea, showed him a letter that explained the boy had been sent to a cousin in Rutland. The sheriff nodded, even smiled. But afterward he sat in his car for nearly 30 minutes, engine off. Something had disturbed him. He never wrote a report. Over time, the house seemed to change shape. People began calling it the house with too many beds. Not out loud, just in passing, in hushed talk behind the dry goods store. That house always has room, someone would say. Too much room, and yet the rooms were never open. The drapes remained drawn. The snow on the roof melted unevenly. At night, if you stood far enough down the road, you could swear that the lights in the upper rooms didn't flicker like kerosene should. They pulsed, steady, unnatural, like breath held too long. And always, there were no children in the yard. No one knew what they were afraid of, not really. The Stantons were kind. They baked, they donated, they went to church. And that's what made it worse, because everyone agreed if something wrong was happening in that house, it was happening under perfect silence, under warm light, under the gentle hum of normal. The year was 1906 when a traveling school inspector named Edward Mallory arrived in Varnum's Hollow. He wasn't sent because of suspicion, but because of rotation. Every 4 years, the state required an audit of rural homeschooling and private guardianships. Most visits were brief. He carried a small canvas bag with pre-printed ledgers and a folded map. His task was simple: verify names, check attendance logs, ensure children placed in long-term guardianship were receiving basic education. Most farms cooperated. The valley was quiet, the people generous in their own way. But the Stanton home was different, not hostile, not secretive, just overly prepared. Mrs. Stanton greeted him before he'd even reached the steps, offering bread, gesturing toward a rocking chair on the porch. She spoke with practiced warmth, a tone he'd heard before from households eager to steer conversations away from specifics. When he asked for the children, she explained they were resting, recovering from a seasonal illness, nothing serious. When he requested the schooling ledgers, she retrieved a pristine folder with names written in identical handwriting. No grades, no dates, no subject matter, just a list, first names only, some repeated across years. As if time never moved forward inside the Stanton home, only circled. That was the first detail that made Edward write a note in the margin. He returned the next morning, this time without calling ahead. The house looked the same, yet felt altered. The curtains that had been open yesterday were shut. There was no sound from inside. He knocked. Mr. Stanton answered, calm, courteous. He welcomed Edward inside, but stood too close as he spoke. When Edward asked again about the school logs, Mr. Stanton repeated the same phrase his wife had used. The children were not ready for visitors. Their learning was private, spiritual. They followed a different rhythm. Edward mentioned the state requirement for photographs, documentation of living condition and basic hygiene. Stanton smiled, reached into a drawer and produced 5 photographs. Each showed a child standing still in a white shift, backlit so harshly that the face was lost to glare. No names, no dates. Edward asked how old the photographs were. Stanton said they had all been taken in the last 2 weeks. Edward noted the stains on the paper edges. He asked if the children could be summoned, just briefly, for confirmation. Mr. Stanton placed a hand on the folder and calmly explained that illness and trauma made sudden visits inappropriate. That was the second detail. The way refusal was delivered like a favor. That night, Edward stayed in the inn above the butcher's. He reviewed the records again. Something gnawed at him. The names listed in the Stanton folder: Ellis, Marianne, Henry. Tilly, none matched the census enrollment for the previous 3 years. He cross-referenced church logs. Baptism names existed but were misspelled. Some had dates but no birth records. Others were only partial initials next to vague notes like delivered to care. No family connections, no prior guardians. Edward began to feel a slow dread that he couldn't explain. It wasn't that the Stantons were hiding something. It was that the system had given them nothing to hide. The church had accepted the names. The school had no reason to question blank lines. And the town, with its small kindnesses and silent corners, had accepted that children came and went. And that was the end of it. On the third morning, Edward returned to the house alone. He walked the perimeter before knocking. Through the basement window, he saw what looked like a laundry room. Large bins, pale sheets soaking in gray water. But on the far wall, he saw something strange. A collection of wooden frames, evenly spaced, covered in cloth. He thought they were drying racks until he saw the pins. Not metal. Bone. Small and sharpened. He tapped on the glass. No one answered. When he finally approached the door, it opened before he could knock. Mrs. Stanton stood there, smiling. She apologized for the delay, said she had just finished baking. He stepped inside. The bread was on the counter, still steaming, but no knives, no plates, only a single teacup set at the far end of the table, like someone had been waiting for him. They talked for 20 minutes, nothing useful. When he rose to leave, Mrs. Stanton insisted on giving him a parting gift, a photograph. She handed him an envelope sealed with wax, told him to open it when he got back to town. He nodded, thanked her. He walked quickly, then ran once he was out of sight. When he reached the inn, he opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Not of a child. Of him. Taken from behind, walking up the path that morning. He stared at it for hours. The lighting matched the sunrise exactly. The trees were aligned. It had been taken no more than 90 minutes before she gave it to him. There were no camera stands visible, no sign of anyone following. And on the back of the photograph, in identical handwriting as the children's ledger, was a word he did not understand. Withdrawn. Edward filed his report. He marked the Stanton visit as completed, no irregularities. He left the valley 2 days later and never returned. But for the rest of his life, he kept that photograph in a drawer. Never showed it to anyone, but sometimes when the wind shifted, he swore he could still smell warm bread behind him. The attic of the Stanton house was never mentioned in church circles or casual conversation. It was not part of the floor plan shared with county inspectors, nor was it ever offered as a tour when new children arrived. It had no staircase leading to it, only a steep ladder disguised behind a tall shelf filled with hymnals that smelled of varnish and winter mold. To those unfamiliar with the home, the shelf looked solid, immovable. But those who had lived in the house long enough, or had lasted long enough, knew the wood was lighter than it appeared, hollow behind its spine. The shelf creaked to the left if you leaned on the right hymn. Behind it was a door. Not painted, not stained, just raw wood with a single line of salt carved around the frame. It had no knob, only a finger-sized hole you had to press into. The wood was soft, not from age, but from use. There were no hinges. The door opened forward as if inhaling those who entered. Inside was not a room in the usual sense. It was colder than the rest of the house, though no windows broke the walls. The floor sloped downward in a way the outside structure did not reflect. The corners were rounded, almost organic, like the inside of something once alive. And in the center stood a table, narrow and long, made of bleached pine that shimmered faintly when no one moved. On the table were hourglasses, dozens of them, each filled with fine white sand that moved upward, never down. The glass didn't curve. It twisted as if each had been spun while still molten, forming a spiral that disobeyed gravity. The sand didn't fall. It rose, slowly, as if drawn towards something above the ceiling that wasn't quite heaven. The hours marked on the bases were scratched in with fingernails, not etched with tools. Some were missing numbers. Others repeated the same number over and over like a chant. Around the room, jars were mounted on narrow shelves that circled the walls like a crown. They were small, each sealed with dark wax and labeled in the same tight cursive, only one word per jar. Hush. There were over 100. Inside each jar, floating in a strange syrup the color of old milk, were teeth. Not full sets, just 1 or 2 per jar. Some were baby teeth, some clearly not. The roots had been blackened. The edges were too clean, as if pulled not in panic but in ceremony. One jar had a date etched faintly into the glass. December 3rd, 1902. That was the week little Henry went missing from the county orphanage and was quietly marked as reclaimed by kin. But no kin had ever come. At the far end of the room there was a chair, simple, wooden, too narrow for any adult to sit comfortably. Leather straps hung from the arms, thin and almost decorative. Underneath the seat was a groove, stained with something dull brown. Above the chair where a child's head might rest was a mirror. But it didn't reflect the room, it showed the hourglasses from behind. Always from behind. Even when no one stood there. And when someone sat in the chair, as at least 20 children had, the mirror would reflect the moment just before, not of them walking in, but of them being brought in. By hands that never showed, always the same rhythm, the child, the chair, the jar. It was Mrs. Stanton who arranged the room. Her husband built the furniture, but the rituals were hers. She believed in silence as a form of control and in stillness as a way to freeze time. She thought noise poisoned memory, that a child who learned to hush could forget anything, even pain. Especially pain. She taught this in whispers held in the dark as the hourglasses rose. The children who learned quickly were spared the straps. The ones who didn't were brought in twice. And once, when a boy tried to scream, she placed a jar in his hands and said the word slowly until he bit down hard enough to offer something for the collection. By morning, the door would be resealed. The shelf slid back. The hymnals stood straight. And no one would know the attic had bled time backwards for another night. The Stanton wheat field was a strange kind of beautiful, too symmetrical, too quiet. Even when the wind moved through it, the stalks barely swayed, as if whatever grew there had agreed long ago to hold still. No birds ever landed on the fence posts, no deer ever grazed its edge. The soil was dark and rich, but always slightly damp, even in drought. Some said it was the way the Stantons tilled it, some special method they kept to themselves. Others avoided walking past it at all. But Mabel Decker, age 13, had never believed in such things. She was a farmer's daughter, a stubborn one, and most days she cut across the wheat when bringing bread to the hollow's elder widow. That morning in late spring, her foot struck something solid beneath the stalks. A metallic thunk, out of place in the soil. She dropped her basket, crouched, and brushed the topsoil away. There, rusted and flat, was a metal lid. No markings, no latch. Just a small hinge at one side, as if it had once been opened often, then forgotten. She pried at it with a broken stick until the seal gave with a soft metallic groan. Inside was a crate, heavy, buried deliberately, not by chance. It smelled wrong, not of rot, but of old wax and copper. She expected tools, maybe hidden liquor, but what lay inside was quieter, more careful. A child's hairbrush, small and wooden, its bristles stiff with hardened wax. The handle was carved with the initials E.T., a name not listed on any registry from the county, not matched to any birth records. The brush sat on folded cloth, yellowed with time, stained at the center with a brown ring. Beneath it was a second object, larger, curved, and pale. She lifted it and froze. It was a human jawbone, broken clean down the center. But what made her drop it was what had been carved into its surface. Tiny musical notes etched with something sharp, almost too precise for hands to have done. The scale was unfinished, ending on a rising pitch, as if the last sound was cut off. The teeth were still intact, but smoothed, like they'd been sanded for display. Mabel stood there for several minutes, unsure if she should scream or close the lid. In the end, she did neither. She walked back to the fence, climbed over, and told no one. For 3 days, she said nothing. But each night she dreamed of the crate. The Stanton family never asked why the wheat in that patch was flattened in a circle. If they noticed, they said nothing. But late that week, a small fire burned behind their barn. No one saw it start. No one called it in. By morning, the ground where Mabel had found the crate was blackened clean. No trace of metal, no remains. Mabel returned and found only ash, still warm. But the dreams didn't stop. They got worse. She heard the musical notes in her sleep, not in tune but whispered, always from behind her, always unfinished. And once, just once, she woke to find wax on her fingertips. She tried to draw the symbols she saw carved into the jawbone. She showed them to her father, who scolded her for wasting time on foolishness. She took them to the church, where the pastor grew silent and tucked the paper into his sleeve without a word. Later that week, he resigned and left town. Mabel eventually stopped drawing, but she never returned to the wheat field. Not even when the Stantons invited her for supper the next harvest. She faked a fever. Her parents were disappointed, but they let her stay home. That night, something scratched at her window. When her father checked, nothing was there, just 3 lines drawn in the condensation. 3 notes, a rising scale, the same unfinished music carved into bone. And though she would live a long life, marry and have children, Mabel never again listened to music. She covered the radios in her home with quilts. She unplugged the phonograph gifted on her wedding day, because somewhere deep in her memory, buried like that crate, was a sound she had never actually heard, a lullaby carved in calcium, a song shaped by suffering. And she understood in a way no child should that some music was not meant to be played, only remembered by those who found it in fields where nothing truly grew. They didn't call it torture. Not then, not in the polite language of county records and whispered church talk. The reports from the early 1900s referred to it as a method of adjustment, a quieting protocol for children who had been deemed difficult, volatile, or developmentally delayed. The word Stanton became shorthand in certain clerical circles for a kind of solution no one wanted to name. The Stanton Method was never written down, not fully, but pieces of it survived in folded letters, abandoned notes, and the slow, guilt-heavy voices of long-retired social workers interviewed in their final years. They remembered the children who went to the Stanton home. Thin, restless, some barely able to speak from early trauma, and how those same children, if they were ever seen again, returned different. Not improved, just different. Slower, quieter, eyes downcast, reflexes dulled like water over stone. One social worker recalled a boy named Amos who had once bitten a nurse when she tried to bathe him. He was sent to the Stanton home at age 6. He came back 2 years later with fingernails grown into his palms and a paralyzing fear of lamps. He couldn't explain why. He didn't speak at all, but when someone accidentally turned on the hallway light, He wet himself and screamed a word no one could translate. The method relied on three core elements: silence, darkness, and rhythm. The Stantons believed that overstimulation created disobedience, that loud colors, voices, even hope could ruin a child's ability to listen. So upon arrival, children were stripped of personal items. Clothing was burned or buried. Names were sometimes replaced with flowers or just colors. A child might go weeks without hearing their own name spoken again. Rooms were windowless, lit only by a single blue oil lamp placed outside the door. Beds were hard wooden slabs lined with books of pressed plants, which the children were told to study without reading. Speaking aloud was met with consequence, not beatings, not bruises, but removal. One child told a later caregiver that he'd been taken to the hollow for 3 days when he whispered. He didn't explain what the hollow was. He only said he came back thirsty and unable to cry. Mrs. Stanton oversaw the routine with a strange sense of pride. She was not cruel in the way people imagined. She offered meals, combed hair, sang hymns with no words. But she monitored behavior like a botanist watching wilt. She took notes constantly, not in books, but on the walls behind paintings on the underside of tabletops, and once carved into a child's headboard. Each entry began with a symbol, a branch, a root, a droplet. Observations followed. Does not dream. Wanders during rain. Pretends to remember mother. These were not punishable flaws. But they were weaknesses to be pressed, and once pressed they were recorded again, changed slightly, refined. The child became less a person, more a pattern. Over time their needs were subtracted. Sugar was removed, then meat, then milk. Some were fed only boiled oats and water for months, told that sweetness would return once their behavior did. It never did. The regression was not accidental. It was part of the design. The Stantons believed that healing came not through therapy or affection, but through reversion. That the child must forget their voice, their memory, even their internal sense of time. There was a set of small locked boxes in the hall closet later discovered by contractors. Inside were objects: a cloth button, a tooth, a baby shoe, a drawing of a horse with no eyes. Each was tagged with a letter and a date, not names, just symbols. The boxes had no hinges, only seals, as if they were not meant to be opened again, as if the thing stored inside was not the object, but the last part of the child's self that remembered who they were. One of the social workers interviewed in 1973 cried when she spoke about the Stanton children, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. They stopped needing things, she said. They stopped asking for anything at all. She called it the most successful failure she'd ever witnessed. And when asked if she'd ever reported the Stantons, she went quiet for almost a minute before answering. We didn't know what we were looking at, she said. They weren't broken, just quiet. Then she added almost to herself, too quiet to fix. It was during the renovation of the Stanton house in the spring of 1948 that the second ledger was found. The main floorboards had long rotted, and as a demolition crew pried them up to lay new beams, a shallow cavity was uncovered between the joists, not deep enough to hide anything valuable, but just wide enough for a narrow wooden box sealed with wax and wrapped in a child's quilt. The box had no markings, no lock, no hinges, but it opened on its own once the wrapping was removed, as if it had been waiting for breath or warmth. Inside was a book, handmade, bound in what looked like untreated calfskin, the pages brittle and yellow. There was no title, no introduction, just a list. Each page held only one name, the first, Marin, Wisteria. Beneath the name, a date. Then beside that, a single pressed petal folded flat and brittle with time. At the bottom of the page, a childlike drawing of a tooth. Always the same style, crude but exact. Each had a small mark etched at the root, like a symbol or letter, though none matched any alphabet known to researchers. The next page read Thomas, Hemlock, then Ellie, Celandine. The names continued in that rhythm. Child, flower, tooth. Dozens of pages, none crossed out, none duplicated. There were no surnames, no explanations, only the same haunting trinity written in the same pale hand. Investigators at the time assumed it was a game, maybe something the children had done to pass time, or perhaps a mourning book for those lost to illness. But botanists called in later noted something far more deliberate. The flowers weren't decorative, they were symbolic. Wisteria, the flower of obsession. Hemlock, the flower of death. Celandine, the flower of spiritual blindness. Each chosen plant bore a folklore, meaning that aligned disturbingly well with known behaviors from the children who had passed through the Stanton home. A child who cried for days before vanishing. A child who refused to eat, then began mimicking birdsong. A child who stopped blinking entirely for over a week. All matched a page, all matched a flower. The pattern was not emotional, it was diagnostic. The book was not made in grief, it was a tool. The teeth, however, disturbed even seasoned analysts. Each one was drawn from a different angle, not in a clinical way, but in a way that suggested familiarity, like the person drawing had held it in their hand for a long time. The sizes varied. Some were molars, others incisors. Some had faint cracks drawn along the enamel. But every tooth had the mark at its base, carved like a crescent opening down, as if something had been scooped out. Dental experts later suggested that if real, those markings would have exposed the pulp, a painful procedure requiring either restraint or unconsciousness. No medical equipment was ever found in the Stanton house. But the ledger suggested that this wasn't a matter of tools. It was a matter of process. The children were not collected, they were catalogued. Each flower assigned based on observed traits, each tooth recorded as if it held the final key to something deeper, something not yet visible. The placement of the ledger also spoke volumes, hidden beneath the floor where the family dined, where they shared soup and said quiet prayers, where visitors were always met with warmth. Directly beneath that was the record. Every meal eaten above it. Every Sunday hymn floated down to rest on its cover. It was never meant to be found. But it also was never burned. That's what haunted the archivist who handled it. She said it felt preserved not by accident but by purpose, as if it was meant to wait, as if it hadn't finished being read. She died of natural causes 6 months later. But in her final entry, she wrote a single line. We thought it was a list of the lost, but maybe it was a recipe. His name, or what was left of it, was Ellis. No surname, no birth certificate that could be traced with certainty. Only a faint half-entry in a 1903 church roster. Ellis, delivered by wagon, not baptized. He had surfaced decades later in a small state-run care home on the outskirts of Concord, New Hampshire. No one knew who brought him in. The intake nurse remembered a man in a brown coat, but no one else saw him arrive. Ellis was in his 70s, hunched with wide, unmoving eyes that blinked at odd intervals, and a left foot that dragged slightly behind. He never spoke. Not once. But 3 days after admission, he began to draw. They were not the aimless scribbles of a fading mind. They were sharp, repeated with precision, always done in sets of 3. The staff gave him notebooks. He filled them. Charcoal, pencil, sometimes blue ballpoint. Always the same image, a row of cabinets, each with a small round window like ship portholes. Inside each a child, suspended by the arms, eyes closed, feet not touching the ground, muzzles tied across their mouths with what looked like piano wire, threading behind the head and into the walls. Some of the children had stitches across the lips. Some had mouths drawn wide open, but with no sound symbols, no musical notation, no breath marks. Only a black X hovering just above their heads, drawn in heavy lines thick enough to tear the paper. One orderly flipped through a full book and whispered that it looked like the children were praying upside down. Doctors called it trauma recall. They encouraged the drawing, filed the images away. But a junior attendant with a background in historic carpentry noticed something strange. The cabinets, or cells or coffins, no one agreed on the word, were not random. They were built from panels with ornamental corners and small carved arches. Confessional booths, he said, old ones, the kind torn out of churches after a fire or when a parish closed down. Ellis somehow knew their structure in detail, where the hinges would creak, where the lock would snap into place. He even drew the iron nail patterns from behind, the parts no child should have seen unless they were inside while they were being built. Eventually, a linguist visited, not for Ellis's silence, but for the symbols. In one drawing, barely noticeable in the upper left corner, were a set of repeated marks, not letters, not musical notes, just curved loops paired with straight vertical lines. The linguist traced them to an obscure notation method used in 19th century monastic silence rituals, a way to track the vow-breaking moments of young initiates in training. Each line meant a noise. Each loop meant regret. The sequence Ellis repeated over and over translated roughly into a phrase written once in the margin of a later sketch. Noise is a door you never unopen. When questioned, gently, with image cards and gestures, Ellis responded only with a blank stare. But when the staff left him alone for long periods, he sometimes hummed, barely audible, a melody with no resolution. Just 4 notes, one after the other, then silence. Always the same notes, a minor key. The exact sequence matched the final 4 tones of a hymn that had once been banned by a rural Vermont diocese for its association with subversive practices during confession. No one at the home had heard of the Stanton family. No one had connected him to the house with too many beds. But one nurse, researching old maps for a genealogy project, stumbled across the name and found herself tracing timelines. She realized that Ellis would have been 4 or 5 during the period when 5 unregistered children were placed in the Stanton home under county welfare, children never recorded leaving. When she printed the names listed in the unofficial ledger and laid them beside the symbols Ellis had drawn, the match wasn't perfect. But it was close enough to raise questions no one had answers for. Ellis died quietly in sleep 3 years after admission. In his final weeks, he stopped drawing. Instead, he took to peeling the corners of wallpaper in his room. Beneath one peeled square, the staff found something that hadn't been there before. A child's tooth pressed into the plaster, and below it, written in charcoal, a single word repeated twice. Still listening. He was buried in a shared grave. His notebooks were boxed and archived under unclaimed. But somewhere beneath that thin state-issued stone, the last surviving voice of the Stanton house remained buried. Silent. Watching. Remembering cabinets that were never meant to be reopened. The barn behind the Stanton house had long since collapsed by the time the property was designated for historical review. Years of frost and weight had folded the structure in on itself like a dying lung. But beneath the rotted beams and nesting rodents buried under layers of ash and splintered pine, a small crawlspace was discovered. It had been sealed not with nails or locks, but with dozens of small stones arranged in a circle, each wrapped in linen stained the color of dried rust. When moved, the stones crumbled as if they'd been waiting to be forgotten. Inside the space was something that, at first glance, looked like an instrument or sculpture. Wood and metal interwoven, bones fitted into gear teeth, a large coil suspended like a spine wound too tight. Local historians trained in antique machinery recognized none of it. There were no manufacturer marks, no labels. But it was unmistakably a clock, a tall one, silent at first. Then as the temperature inside the barn warmed with sunlight, it ticked. The sound was not like a regular clock. It did not follow seconds. It came in bursts, 4 quick ticks, then stillness, then 2 more, slower, deeper, then nothing for several minutes. Then one long groan like a wooden beam twisting under pressure. The chimes weren't bells, they were bones. Rib fragments hung from strings of braided hair, striking hollow femur pipes with each release of the inner coil. The blood was not decoration. It had been lacquered into the wood, sealing the joints. Tests later revealed it was human. Multiple sources, all type O negative, all matching young tissue profiles. No part of the device had been crafted by accident. Every bone was chosen for its resonance. Every gear had a purpose. And at the center of it all was the spine, the central shaft of the clock, the one that drove the ticking, the tension, the measured release, was built from vertebrae threaded together with copper wire and set into a brace of carved oak. It wasn't a replica. It was a real spine, child-sized, preserved in beeswax and resin but with signs of stress along the ligaments, as if it had been held taut for weeks. Medical examination suggested the posture required to shape the spine that way could not be sustained consciously. The body would have needed to be suspended, not hung by the neck, but by the arms and ankles, stretched carefully until the spine began to hold its own tension. That tension was then transferred into the winding system of the clock, powering each tick. The more tension stored, the longer the clock could run, which meant it had to be rewound, not with a key, but with another spine. There were no instructions found with the machine. But beneath the base, carved into the oak in the same thin handwriting seen in the second ledger, was a short message. The time is not kept, it is contained. Forensic experts could not determine how many children had been used to construct the full mechanism. But the presence of different calcium densities suggested at least 6. One historian speculated the device may have been part of a ritual. A way to control silence not just in behavior but in time itself. A metronome for suffering, a calendar of stillness. A machine that ran not on energy but on what was taken from children when they were held too long in fear. The clock was removed and placed in a private archive. It no longer ticks. No one understands why it started that day or why it stopped. But the staff who cataloged it reported a strange sensation when standing near it. A tension in their own spines, a pull between the shoulders, a soft creak in the bones during sleep. And one technician, alone for an evening shift, claimed he heard a whisper behind him after the clock emitted a low groan. It said only 3 words. Do not move. In the fall of 1908, the trees turned faster than usual in Varnum's Hollow. Locals remembered that October for the sudden cold, the early bite in the wind, and the strange quiet that hung over the fields like a held breath. 5 children arrived at the Stanton home during that month. 4 boys and 1 girl, sent by county relief after a fire at a rural boarding school left them without placement. They were delivered together by wagon, wrapped in wool blankets with shoes too large for their feet. A social worker logged their arrival on October 3rd. After that, there were no further entries. No letters, no updates. Not one of the 5 appeared on any school record, church attendance, or community roll call. When November came, it came without them. Neighbors near the Stanton farm noticed something odd in the fields just days after the first frost. Scarecrows. 5 of them. Not unusual for the time of year except for how they were placed, not facing outward toward the edges of the crops, but inward, Arranged in a circle, each figure turned toward the next as if in quiet conversation. They were dressed in mismatched clothes, too small for adults, too worn for mannequins. One wore a striped scarf, still damp from the morning dew. Another had boots with laces tied in the way children are taught, double knotted and dragging. The fabric was stitched with pages, real pages, yellowing scraps torn from old books. Closer inspection revealed they were not storybooks or scriptures, but medical journals. Handwritten, not printed. Diagrams of the human ear, notes on vocal paralysis, a full page from a dissection manual detailing the removal of a tongue with minimal hemorrhage. The pages had been sewn into the seams like lining, as if the knowledge had to be hidden inside the body to matter. The scarecrows' faces had no features, only rough ovals made of burlap, but each had eyes drawn in with kohl, small, too close together, with heavy black rings that ran in downward lines like tears. They weren't cartoonish, they were focused, and they stared at one another with something more than blankness. Witnesses said they looked as though they were waiting for someone to speak first. When the wind moved, the arms creaked inward as if reaching toward one another but never quite touching. Farm hands sent to thresh the field refused to go near them. One claimed the scarves moved without wind. Another said he heard whispering when he turned his back. Mrs. Stanton explained them away as a harvest tradition, a tribute to those lost in the season of change. She called it an inner ring of watchers. Something old from her childhood, she said. No one challenged her, not directly. But word spread. Children began crossing to the other side of the road when passing the farm. A pastor stopped including the Stantons in his prayer list, and a letter was sent anonymously to the county warning that something had gone wrong on that land. The letter was never followed up. It was November by then and the ground had hardened. The scarecrows remained standing until the week before the first snow. Then they vanished, not burned, not packed away, just gone. But beneath where one had stood near the far edge of the field, a woman collecting herbs found something. A mitten, child-sized. Inside it was a page, not torn but carefully folded. It bore a title, Harvesting Speech Pathways in Early Childhood. Below it, a single sentence was underlined in red ink. The voice must be preserved in the tension between desire and denial. No children were reported missing from local homes that year. The 5 placed at the Stanton farm had no known relatives. Their names faded from county memory, replaced with new transfers, new placements. But in later years, when a new family moved onto the property, their son refused to play in the fields. He said the ground was too loud, that every step sounded like breathing. And once, while digging to plant squash, he uncovered a child's scarf tied in a perfect circle, with a piece of coal nestled in the knot, worn smooth as if once used to draw something that could still see. The Stanton dining room was the only part of the house that felt warm year-round. Guests remembered it for the polished table, the quiet ticking of the wall clock, and the smell of barley broth always simmering just out of sight. But beneath the lace curtains and the stitched napkins, something pressed against the silence. Something that hadn't faded, not even after the house stood empty for years. That something was Ellie. No last name, no birth record, no school enrollment. But she was there, hidden in wood and ash, the only child who ever left a mark that lasted. She was placed with the Stantons in the winter of 1909, one of the youngest the family ever took in. Just 8 years old, small for her age, with a twisted ankle that never healed right. She came with nothing but a threadbare coat and 1 pair of socks, red woolen, a gift from the nun who'd watched her the first 2 months after her father died. That winter was colder than usual, and the fireplace in the Stanton dining room was always lit. It burned too clean with a scent that didn't quite match any wood found on the property. Ellie was not like the others. She did not go silent the way the house expected. She asked questions. She noticed things. She listened too closely to how the other children chewed their food without expression, how they blinked less and less the longer they stayed. She watched the way Mrs. Stanton stirred her tea in slow circles even when it was empty, and she waited. At night she would crawl under the long dining table and lie still. It was the only place where no one looked. Above her, the adults spoke in low tones. She memorized patterns. She noticed that one chair at the table was never used, the one closest to the chimney. Instead, that space was always set but left untouched, as if waiting for someone not yet dead. When the others were led upstairs, Ellie stayed behind once. She had found a box of kitchen matches and burned the tip of one until it blackened, then used the charred wood to scratch a name into the underside of the table. Her name, Ellie. Not a full scream, just enough to say, "I was here." She pressed hard until the wood flaked. She knew she might not get another chance. She was last seen on a Thursday. No one reported her missing. Her case file stopped at placement. Her page in the second ledger read Celandine, first frost bloom. But she had already started resisting the method. She stopped eating. She hummed. She stayed awake. At some point when they came for her during the night, she bit someone hard enough to draw blood. It was the only documented injury suffered by either Stanton. A neighbor recalled seeing Mrs. Stanton with a bandaged hand the next morning. She said she'd caught it on a broken plate. No plates were found broken. Years later, in the 1980s, a fire inspector arrived to examine the property after a partial chimney collapse. A thunderstorm had cracked the bricks from the inside, revealing a clogged flue sealed with soot and age. Inside, wedged into the narrow bend of the chimney wall, was fabric, tightly balled. It took hours to remove. What they pulled out was a single wool sock, child-sized, faded, but unmistakably red. Still intact, still warm to the touch from the heat trapped in the stone. Tucked inside the sock was a small piece of twine. Not rope, twine. The kind used to bind hair or lace shoes in places without laces. Twisted carefully as if someone had hidden it there on purpose. No bones, no note. Just the sock, the string, and a quiet that refused to lift. The table, long since removed, was found in a salvage yard 50 miles north. A carpenter sanding its underside noticed the name. It had been scratched over with gouges, but not deep enough to erase. Ellie. The match head was still embedded in the groove beside it, fused into the grain by time. The carpenter showed it to his daughter. She kept the table. She said it felt like someone was still sitting under it, watching, waiting for the right moment to be remembered again. Beneath the Stanton kitchen, under the tiled floor worn smooth by decades of quiet footsteps and ladled broth, there was a space no blueprint marked and no visitor ever entered. The crawl space had no visible hatch. It was accessed through a panel in the pantry wall, behind a stack of canning jars filled with preserved roots no one remembered planting. The opening was barely wide enough for an adult to pass through and required crawling on elbows and knees along a dirt tunnel no longer than a hallway rug. At the end of that tunnel sat a door, not wood, not metal. Something in between, like pressed ash hardened into shape, the texture of long-extinguished bone fire. It had no handle, just a carved spiral, deep enough to catch a palm. The kind of door that recognized pressure more than keys. Inside, the temperature dropped without reason. No windows, no airflow. Yet it stayed cold enough for breath to show, even in summer. The room was small, square, and uneven. The walls had been draped in black lace, thin and frayed, cut from the same fabric used in mourning veils of a past century. Beneath the lace were old nursery rhymes hand-stitched onto parchment, then sewn into the fabric with black thread. The words had faded, but the needle holes remained, each one a stutter in the fabric like the hush between sobs. Candles lined the room's edges, arranged in patterns that made no sense on first glance but repeated upon closer look. Each candle had been shaped into a child's face. No two alike. Some smiled, some wept, some had eyes closed. All of them had their wicks placed where the mouth would be. When lit, the flame emerged not from the top, but from between their lips, as if something inside them was still trying to speak. The altar was the room's center, low to the ground, no taller than a child's chest. It had been built from cradle wood. The slats of disassembled bassinets repurposed and nailed together in a way that left the curve of the rockers still visible. On its surface sat a cracked mirror surrounded by 4 blindfolds made of velvet strips. The blindfolds were stiff with age and disuse, but they had clearly once been worn. Each bore faint indentations of tears, small dried patches of salt along the fabric's edge. The mirror was not full-sized, only large enough to reflect a child's face. But the glass had been scratched, not shattered, lines drawn across it with intent diagonal crosshatches and gentle spirals that blurred any reflection into an unrecognizable shape. A child looking into it would not see themselves. They would see the outline of a face, no features, only a moving blur. Something that used to be them but no longer held shape. The ritual performed there was never written down, but its design left little to imagination. A child was blindfolded and led forward, placed on their knees before the altar. The blindfold would be removed. They were told to look, to hold their gaze, to keep watching until the face in the glass either spoke or disappeared. The process took hours, sometimes days. The child could not eat, could not sleep, could not cry. The candles were lit one by one until all faces burned. When the last wick went out, the ritual was complete. No punishment was given during this time. No words were spoken. The child either returned to the upstairs rooms changed, slower, quieter, unblinking, or they did not return at all. The crawlspace was discovered decades later during a foundation inspection after a small earthquake revealed shifting beams beneath the kitchen floor. Workers found the passage by accident. The room had collapsed partially, but the altar remained buried under soil and soot. The candles had melted down into soft lumps, but some faces still showed. The mirror had shattered, but only along its edges. The center remained intact, enough to still show the vague outline of anyone who knelt before it. One worker, unfamiliar with the history of the house, looked into it and reportedly whispered, "Is that me?" before collapsing in a seizure. He recovered, but he never returned to the job. The black lace was taken as evidence. Each panel had a date stitched into the hem. All dates fell between 1904 and 1910. All matched the years when the Stanton house received children who were never seen again. No one ever found the 4th blindfold. Only 3 were recovered. The 4th was never logged. But one piece of velvet was later found nailed behind the pantry door. Stiff, stained, folded as if still waiting to be worn. In 1922, without warning or witness, the Stanton family disappeared. No notice, no belongings taken. No final correspondence sent to church or county. The house remained locked from the inside, the fire still warm in the hearth, loaves rising in the oven as if someone would return to remove them. But no one did. A local boy sent to deliver flour was the first to notice the silence. He knocked, then circled the home. No dog barked, no footsteps came to greet him. Inside, dishes were still set for 2. A chair was overturned at the far end of the kitchen. In the parlor, a rocking chair moved slowly, though the air was still. The sheriff was summoned. He found no sign of struggle. The beds were made. The clocks were wound. But the attic was sealed. The pantry shelves stood in front of the wall as they always had. No trace of the Stantons, not husband, not wife, not even a single strand of hair. They were simply gone. After 6 months with no contact, the county declared the property abandoned. It was sold to the state for a nominal fee and quietly converted into a juvenile reformatory. The logic on paper made sense. It was already fitted with multiple bedrooms, a strong fence, and isolated land. They gutted the attic and sealed the basement, painted over the wallpaper, replaced the cradle altar with a desk. No one mentioned what had come before. The new staff, mostly young nurses and probation workers, were told nothing of the house's prior role. To them, it was just another rural site to house the misbehaved and the unwanted. But the children knew differently. They said the walls remembered. In the fall of 1931, 3 boys were transferred from a Boston institution to the reformatory in Varnum's Hollow. They were unrelated, different ages, different offenses. All arrived within the same week. For a short time, things appeared normal. Then, within 14 days, each boy vanished. No broken windows, no missing keys, no signs of escape. One was last seen reading near the old barn. Another was called for dinner and never arrived. The third was reportedly asleep in his bed when head count was taken. By morning, the bed was empty, the sheets folded as if no one had slept there at all. No witnesses, no footprints, no leads. Only silence. The official explanation blamed record-keeping errors. The boys were listed as erroneously transferred, and no further investigation was launched. But one clerk, disturbed by the pattern, returned to the house weeks later. She had been the one to catalog its earlier contents before the conversion. The one who boxed the second ledger and marked it for storage. On a hunch, she unlocked the archive. The ledger had changed. 3 new entries had been added since her last review. The ink was darker, the pen strokes newer, and the handwriting was not the same. The original entries had been made by a careful hand, curved and consistent. These new ones were sharper, more rushed, each name followed by a botanical label not previously used: Datura, belladonna, foxglove. Next to each was a sketch, not of a tooth but of a lock. 3 locks, all different shapes, drawn in heavy black pencil, and beside each a child's initial. JMA, all 3 matched the first names of the missing boys. The clerk tried to report it, but the ledger was dismissed as unreliable, an artifact of a house meant to be forgotten. She was let go 2 months later. She died in an asylum 10 years after that. In her personal effects, they found a photocopy of the last page. She had circled the 3 new entries in red pencil. Below them, she had written one line: "The handwriting doesn't match, but the hand does." After that, the reformatory changed protocols. Fewer children were assigned to it, then none. By 1940, it was shuttered entirely, left to rot behind state fencing. But every few years, someone breaks in. A teenager, a thrill-seeker, a researcher. And sometimes, on the old chapel wall, new etchings appear, names that aren't in any roster, symbols no one remembers. And always, somewhere on the premises, a flower pressed between pages not yet torn, dried, labeled, and carefully preserved. Waiting for someone to notice that closure had never actually come, only its imitation. A silence mistaken for peace, a pause that promised nothing.